Hi, I'm Ryan McHugh, president of Tiny Home Connection, Denver, Colorado native, and my partner here, Scott.
Hi, I'm Scott Updegraff, and I'm not a native, but I've lived most of my life in Colorado and love it here. We met up probably about a year ago and had a lot of common interests. I came from a construction background as well, and grew up in the building family, builder and a realtor, and just really got to see beautiful custom homes, and then always aspired to have one of those. And then when I had one, I didn't really want one because it took up all my time, it took up all my money, etc. So years ago, probably 3 years ago or so, more now, 4, I started looking into tiny homes and just was hooked as soon as I saw them. And fortunately, I've ended up here talking with Ryan and working with Ryan on spreading the tiny home movement. So, and I guess I'm curious, what really got you into tiny homes? I mean, what excited you about it?
So I actually had a 4-bedroom house right out of college, and
Nice.
I was single at the time. I bought the house. My brother helped me do some fixing up to it and whatnot.
Single, but you had a few college roommates at the
I
time,
mean,
probably.
there was had the availability there.
Yeah.
But basically, the front room of the house was empty the entire, for at least the first 2 years.
Yeah, no furniture.
Because no furniture. It was like that living room that's just got the nice couches that nobody ever sits in.
Right.
I didn't even have the couches. I had just floor space. And it wasn't until I got a girlfriend a little bit later on that we started filling it up with stuff, because it had to fill it up, because that's what they tell you. You got to have furniture in your house.
Got to have your drapes and
every
room, all that.
Yeah. And so after a while, taking care of the house, taking care of the yard, all of the yard work, all the maintenance on the house, all the money that I was spending on all of it, I thought that I had a really good job in what I was doing. I was very successful at, but I wasn't doing any of the stuff that I wanted to do. All of my time was involved in taking care of this house and upkeep of this lifestyle that I was told I'm supposed to live.
Right.
And so I started going through a lot of the stuff. I'd go through my kitchen cabinets and whatnot and open them up, and there'd be things I didn't even know I had. Things that are still brand new in their box.
Yep.
And it was like, where did I get this?
The bullet blender.
Exactly. Yeah, I had like 2 of those. And like a salad tosser. It just spun your salad. I never used it. But I had.
And those are kind of big for tiny homes too, by the way.
Yeah,
the bullet blender
really
could work, but yeah.
I mean, I'm old school. You gotta use the spoons.
Absolutely.
It does the trick.
Absolutely.
But really started looking at what I owned and what I was spending my money on. Started downsizing my stuff. Started getting into the idea of having less stuff. I moved all of my personal possessions up into my room, and I started renting out the rest of the house.
Wow.
And so it. Eventually, I had plans to sell the house in 5 years. I sold it almost to the day. 5 years later, moved into a 1-bedroom apartment, and that was very therapeutic, getting rid of even more stuff.
Liberating.
Yeah.
For sure.
And got into a 1-bedroom apartment, and even then, I was like, I still have too much stuff. I don't need all of this. You walk around and you see little trinkets. I got this on a vacation one time that I have pictures and I have memories of that vacation. I don't need this doohickey thing. And so would always have like a box, and I would walk around and I would see stuff and I'd be like, what is this? Do I need this? Have I used it in the last 3 months? Did I know about it in the last 6 months?
Does it bring you joy?
Right. If I said no, it went in the box, and it was
gone.
It was gone.
Nice.
But even more than that, I missed portions of that house. Number one was the garden in the back. I had a huge vegetable garden, and it was so cool being able to go outside, grilling up a steak, and you go cut up your vegetables and throw in there fresh tomatoes, cut those up, your fresh basil, and create a salad out of the garden that you have in your backyard. I miss that the most.
What would you do in the and I didn't mean to interrupt. I mean, continue to tell me, what brought you to it. But, what would you do if you had a tiny home and needed a garden? How would you solve that? I mean, because your tiny home is probably not big enough unless you have one of those vertical wall gardens, I guess.
That
right?
I was going to say, I'm going to do a vertical wall, at least for the herbs.
Yeah,
I see a ton of pictures of tiny
Absolutely.
houses online, on Facebook, on social media, on TV.
But we definitely need gardening.
Gardening,
Yes.
whether it's outside or inside,
Right.
depending on where you're at. Colorado, you're kind of seasonal, limited.
Sure.
But you do something inside, or if you have a greenhouse that you can go year round, which would
Absolutely.
be ideal.
Absolutely.
But I definitely want like a living wall
Right.
in my house. Well, it doesn't have to be an entire wall,
Right.
but it could be, a section of a wall or the backsplash of your kitchen that you're pulling
Fresh
you know,
herbs.
fresh
I think you
the
mentioned
smell
basil
of it.
before, right?
Yeah, right. Basil, I love doing that. Some cilantro,
Right.
some thyme.
Right.
Just having that and setting it up so it's on a drip system and it's all part of the system. I think I don't see enough tiny houses with even just live plants in them, let alone
Right.
edible
I agree.
plants. I think
agree.
so.
look
That's
forward
something
to-
that I want to incorporate.
Yeah, I look forward to the days when there's a community of tiny homes, where there's a village maybe that has a common garden area where we can go to, which I'm sure we'll talk about
Somebody
here
should
eventually.
put something like that together.
So what other things? Anything else you'd mention that really attracted you? I mean, you talked a lot about the freedom. I mean, I think that equates to financial freedom too, right?
I mean, financial freedom trickles down into everything else. You have financial freedom. You have the freedom to do other things.
Right.
The next big thing is going to be your time freedom.
Right.
If I have the money to do things now, I just need the time to do them.
Yeah.
And I think a tiny house addresses both of those.
Absolutely.
You don't have to work, your 60 hours a week to afford to come home to a house that you can't afford to do anything else but live in the house.
Right. Or work on the house.
Or work on the house and use the extra money that you do have on the house. Yeah.
I've done a lot of that in my past.
But your to-do list is never ending on the
Yeah,
house.
yeah.
There's always something else you could be doing.
What do you think about the to-do list on a tiny home?
It's a tiny to-do
It's
list.
a tiny to-do list.
Yeah.
Everything's smaller, at least. You mop the floor, it's 150 square feet
Exactly.
instead of 2,500 square feet or 1,500, whatever the case is. But
Yeah.
So very cool. So financial, I think we talked a little bit about, the whole maintenance and the upkeep, right? I mean, you talk about your weekends.
And it depends on who builds it and how it's built, too,
Sure,
obviously.
sure.
You have a well-built, well-maintained house, it's going to last you a while, and you're not having to do maintenance upkeep to it all the time.
Right.
It also goes down to what materials you're using.
Right.
Certain materials are going to lend themselves, and some even offer warranties
Sure.
beyond, whatever minimal warranty you're going to get with just the material itself.
Right.
Obviously.
Yeah, I remember looking for homes. I mean, when I looked for our last home, it was a lot of poor quality. A lot of it was due to bentonite soil, which wouldn't affect a tiny home on wheels. At least it might, it might not be level or for a while.
Not as drastically.
Exactly,
sure.
not as drastically. But I just remember looking at all the house, and we thought we bought a nice house, from a reputable builder. And but there was a lot of little things, and I think that's one of the things you and I have talked about before, is just the passion to do things better.
Absolutely.
And not have people have to worry about a pipe exploding in their wall, or electrical arcing in their wall, and the place burning down. I think that's something that I felt I could contribute, preventing. In the industry, because especially in the tiny home industry right now. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, there's a lot.
I think you touched on it really well. Is if you're gonna find a tiny house builder, I think passion is number one.
Right.
Find somebody that's passionate about the lifestyle. That's going to feed into their passion for the build.
Sure.
If they're just out to try to take advantage of the trend in tiny houses and just maybe they built a doghouse before, and that makes them qualified to build a tiny house because it's essentially unregulated right now. Right? Yeah. They're really just looking to get it done and get it through and get paid. Versus somebody that's going to really take an interest in in addressing your lifestyle going
Right.
into the tiny house
Right.
and incorporating those things into the house, and making sure that those things are going to be quality, quality materials, quality workmanship. And the big talk right now in the building industry side of it is the regulation and the standardization.
Sure.
Building these things to a certain standard, which I think is what got a lot of people, a lot of builders into the industry in the first place. Was it's the Wild West of builders right now. It's unregulated.
Right.
There's no standard that you're required to follow. There's no
Right.
permitting process.
Right. I mean, I think you and I even looked the other night at a particular municipality, and their requirements on tiny home basically was a mobile home certification, right?
Right, and so they're
which doesn't
they're
really
following
apply to a tiny home, obviously.
Right,
Yeah.
and they were showing where the tiny home kind of falls.
Right,
And they were
right.
saying most tiny homes, because of the simple fact that they're on wheels, fall into the category of an RV.
Right. So they're not really
If
inspected.
you remove the wheels when you're placing it, then it falls into the category of a mobile home.
Sure.
If you fix it to a foundation or build it on a foundation, you're now qualified as a site-built fixed structure.
So you're getting a building permit.
Right,
basically.
going
Okay.
through the county
Yep.
assessor's office, and they're the ones in charge of
Inspections,
doing
right.
the inspections and
Right.
all of that.
Right.
The problem is the lifestyle is in this crack between all three of those. There's not one code that really can address
Right.
one situation or the other. It's, are you on wheels? You're an RV, but you can't live in it full time. But their standards are below what a site-built structure would be.
Sure.
And a mobile home is going to be in between those. But you have to remove the wheels
Right.
for it to be a mobile home.
Right.
Um,
And a mobile home, I mean, it's at least designed to be lived in full time, right? Whereas an RV is not, right?
Correct.
I mean, it's meant to take out during the summer, over the weekends, to go up and go boating on Lake Guernsey or whatever the
right,
case
it's
is.
just that. It's a recreational
Right,
vehicle,
right.
not a primary
Right,
residence.
right.
Um,
I think some people haven't figured that out yet, but
yeah, I mean, you live in an RV full time for
Right,
18 months.
right.
You'll see
You'll-
that they're
you'll
not
figure it
built
out.
to be a full time
Right,
residence for any
right,
long period
right,
of time.
right.
But that's where tiny houses come in. Is they want that lifestyle. They want
Yep.
the mobility
Yep.
of it. They want the freedom. They don't want the debt
Right.
that comes with
Right.
a lot of a site built home.
Right.
But then they still want to be able to move around if they want. Maybe
Right.
not as much as every weekend or something like that, where they're going to a new town.
Sure.
A lot of people we talk to
Let you
want
have
that
that
lifestyle for
Absolutely.
18 months,
Yeah.
and then they want to settle down.
Right.
But they don't want to have to sell their RV and buy a home. They just want to take their home with them, and then decide on a location and park their house, and there they are.
Traveling to the national parks for 18 months.
How fun would that be?
And then park in your tiny home.
And not have to go through the process of
Right.
selling your RV,
Right.
losing your money on
Right,
that, and then
right.
buying a house that, potentially this day and age, how long are you at one
Yeah.
career?
Yep.
The time of go to school, get good grades, so you can go to college, so you can get a degree,
And work in a
so
cubicle.
you can get a job for 20, 30
Right.
years, and then you can retire,
Right.
and those days are gone.
Right. And the days of working in an office are gone too, I believe, right?
Exactly,
So,
yeah.
Which
More and more people able to do
certainly
the
is
remote.
good for the tiny home movement, for those that are on wheels.
Absolutely.
So, yep.
Yeah, it's difficult because people think that the municipalities think they hate tiny houses, but they're just using what they have currently.
Right.
And so it's going to be a matter of people coming out saying that they want regulations for tiny houses. They want them to be approved. They want them to be addressed. And the way that we do that is not on a one-by-one basis, one at a time. We've got to come together as a community, group together, help each other out, and show the powers that be that this is what we want.
Right.
We are in a democracy. That is our right. That's the power of democracy, is getting together and saying we want some change.
Yeah. How do you see that changing? I mean, I know you and I are involved in something that will hopefully become a nonprofit, but
Yeah.
let's talk about that a little bit, because I think that's something that right now doesn't exist in the tiny home industry as much
Correct.
as it needs
It doesn't.
a place to put it.
And
right?
the way that we're doing it, yeah. I mean, the big question in tiny houses right now is where do you put it?
Right.
And unfortunately, a lot of times, what I love about tiny house people going into tiny houses is they're very, very resilient, very resourceful, and very independent. They're willing to take on this challenge of a tiny house. So they go out and they find the money, or they put the money together and they go out and either find a builder and build it themselves. But then that next hurdle is the biggest one: is where can I put it? So unless you own property that you can be up in the mountains or out, in the middle of nowhere and put your house where nobody's going to complain, is really a non-issue, because the zoning department's not going to come out. They're going to wait for somebody to complain.
And as we've heard, winter's usually the time where people complain because all the leaves fall, right? In a lot of cases, we've heard a couple stories, I think.
But the difficult part is when there's people that don't have those resources to buy a piece of property or place the property. Or on the other hand, they just want to be part of a community.
Sure.
And when you're talking about going to a planning department, a zoning department, a city council, one voice, they say will be heard, but it won't necessarily make any changes. But you get several voices, you get several people in there telling them that this is what we want. That's really going to be the future of tiny houses, is community-driven, widespread change versus, can I place my single tiny house? I need you to do a zoning variance so that I can put my one house. And then you've got to address the thousands of other people individually.
I definitely think if we work together, which is one of the things that really attracted me to the tiny home movement, is that it's not competitive. I hope it stays that way as much as it is, how can we help each other, because we all have a common interest. And you talk about the communities, and I think that's fascinating. And then I think that there aren't communities already. Well, I think it's horrible as well as fascinating that there aren't communities already of tiny homes. I mean,
well, there are. They're just not as. So I guess
for the demand, I guess, right? Because you look
not enough,
right? I mean, because you look at single-family homes and you look at apartment complexes, and here in Colorado, they're going up all over the place all the time.
And that's the problem, is there aren't tiny house communities the way that there should be. They're following the standard business model of a developer going in, buying up a piece of property, fitting as many boxes in that property as he can to make his bottom line as big as possible. The difference is, in addition to that, they're going in and buying up properties and they're setting them up as RV parks or mobile home parks. When you talk to a municipality and you say, hey, I'd like to open up a mobile home park in your community, they're going to be like, we don't want a trailer park. Because that's what they've seen in the past.
In most cases, those aren't that attractive places.
They're a blight on the community.
Typically,
they typically draw surrounding property values down. That's why you always see we love tiny houses, just not in my backyard. People don't want that. But what we're trying to do with this nonprofit is follow the co-op business model. Where instead of going into this community, you bought your home and you're going to pay a lot fee, or perhaps you're going to buy your lot, and then that's the little plot of land that you own, and just putting them next to each other, calling it a community.
So we were just talking about knowing your neighbors, right? I mean,
that development standpoint, you're getting into. Just because you're in close quarters or in proximity of several people, and calling it a community. How many of us have been in a suburb or in a living situation where you have neighbors, you have people that are next to you, but you don't know their names.
And you mentioned close quarters. I mean, sometimes you can see into their bedroom practically.
Because
you don't even know who they are.
You have no idea.
Or what their first name is, for that matter.
Right? I mean, you come up with names for people because you don't know who they are. There's Plaid Shirt McGee over there, and
Mr. Gardener.
Yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
You know, and
The lawnmower man.
The lawnmower man. Man.
Or the guy with the nicest grass in the neighborhood, you know. I always,
we had a guy, we literally called him Speedo Guy because he would mow his lawn in a Speedo.
Oh, now that's upsetting.
It was
so
rough.
in a tiny home community, do you see that being allowed?
We're going to leave that up to each individual community. If you want to outlaw Speedos altogether, you know, it's going to be a board meeting.
I'm for that, for sure.
You know, kind of set up. We'll leave that.
So talk with me a little more about the co-op and kind of what the mission is.
So we've got a group of people putting together the board of directors right now for a nonprofit group. This nonprofit is going to be focused on coming up with kind of a boilerplate template for a community.
Nice.
And then we're going to be advocating to municipalities, to local governments, to planning departments, and really reaching out and finding our friends in the tiny home community that are in, you know, these higher positions that are kind of movers and shakers of the
that understand the need and
because
demand.
there is a need with the housing crisis across the country.
Absolutely.
They're looking for a way to address this. And with what we talked about earlier is you approach a municipality initially with the concept of a tiny home community. Immediately in their head, they're thinking trailer park.
Right.
You know, and so what we're doing is we're putting together a master plan, approaching these communities and telling them what our idea is. Going at this from a co-op standpoint versus a developer standpoint, where our main mission is not the bottom line. Our main mission is a lifestyle that supports tiny houses.
Right.
Tiny houses on wheels is probably the easiest way to go at this point while it's still new.
Sure.
But eventually it will be the lifestyle.
Absolutely.
I mean, earthships are growing in popularity. Schoolies, definitely. Converted vans.
Right.
You know, just that lifestyle where it's a simpler life, and that allows more freedom, financial freedom, time freedom, location freedom. And so we'll be going around and putting together a pilot program where it's a community that basically shows what we're trying to do. And then at the same time talking to the local governments around, and then when we have that pilot community, we can say, here's one that works. It's a different mentality than what you see in a mobile home park or most other tiny house communities right now. Is everyone that lives in the community has a vested interest in that community. They all have put money into it. They don't necessarily own their little plot of land and that's it. They don't care about anything else outside. The story I like to tell with that is I'm from Colorado, grew up in the mountains. I love the state. I love the fact that people are finding out about it and they're coming into it. What I don't like is the mentality of the people that are coming into it. A lot of them come from big cities. They come from places where they're used to somebody else taking care of the surrounding area. Nobody's walking through the mountains picking up trash after you. You know, there's nobody that's doing that.
There's no ownership.
And so they think they can just walk around and throw trash around. So I was walking around downtown, and somebody was walking in front of me, and she was like, I'm from the South, I don't care, and threw a water bottle into the street 10 feet away from a trash can. You know, and so I walked up to it, and I picked it up. I was like, you know what, you can go back. You know, because that's what being a native and where that mentality of, you know, Colorado native, we're kind of this exclusive club.
Completely.
We want to protect what we've got here. We really appreciate what we have, and I don't mind sharing it with people that also appreciate it. And I think bringing that mentality into a tiny home community is important, especially with this co-op setup. Is you're walking around your community, you see a piece of trash on the ground, you're going to pick it up, you're going to take it to a trash, and you're going to recycle it.
Well, even in a regular community, unlike a co-op community that you're talking about, you know, you own your piece of property, but, you know, the government or whoever probably owns the sidewalk, the street, easements, all that other stuff, right? So, but and one of the things I wanted to say about the co-op that I think is very attractive is, and tell me if I'm wrong, but the really cool part, because, you know, tiny home, part of the movement is people want to live a simpler, less expensive, lifestyle, and maybe use that money for other things,
Absolutely.
Like travel or whatever the case is. But the other cool thing about the co-op, I believe, is that it's a price point that tiny home people that are in it for those reasons I just mentioned can actually get into it, right? They're not having to go buy a $250,000 piece of property just to put their tiny home on, right? They're going to hopefully get in for a much less price point, maybe 10% of that or whatever the case is, but then they have that ownership as well.
Absolutely,
so really
that's another thing to think about when you're trying to place a tiny home is you've got the other expenses that go along with it.
Sure.
That people don't really think about. You've got to set up or figure out how to tie into sewer, water, electric.
Right.
You've got to have access to the site.
Right.
So building roads.
Right.
Doing that with one tiny house is going to be more expensive than the tiny house itself.
Yeah.
And so it just is not feasible for most people trying to get into the tiny home lifestyle. You would be getting into that 30-year mortgage debt that we're trying to get away from.
Right.
Going at it as a community, you can then share those expenses as a community. One of the big things about this lifestyle as well is it's a sustainable lifestyle. That's one of the goals of many of the people in the tiny home industry is water conservation, recycling, the amount of trash that you're using, what's your carbon footprint look like.
Right.
Being able to take those into account as a community, you really start to, that's something you could take to the municipality and say, one water tap or one well permit is allowed to feed so many normal
because those can be expensive, right? I mean, water taps can be expensive. So I think being able to share water taps, because, I think one of the things that really another thing that attracted me was just building a tiny home versus building the typical average 2,500 square foot home or whatever that crazy number is. And a tiny home being around 145 square feet average, I think, which seems a little small for me sometimes. But with the tiny home, now I lost track of my thoughts. So I didn't think that was going to happen.
The water,
and
the conservation. Basically, my thought was, you can go to a municipality and tell them, we're trying to put 10 tiny homes in a lot where you would potentially have 2 single-family homes.
Right.
And we would still use less water than those 2 single-family homes.
And I guess that's where I was starting to go is that the construction cost and the impact on the environment when you talk about building a 2,500 stick frame, being wood, home versus building a 150 or 250 or make it 400 square foot, right? Yeah. Tiny home. I mean, the impact on the environment, and that's just building it, right? And we've talked a little bit about then, you gotta fill it with your stuff, right? We talked about your living room and things like that, and then you have to maintain it, and you have to put all those window coverings. And I've heard people talk about people that move into a tiny home save on average around $200 a month on just not over time, just not buying stuff.
Yeah.
Right.
We're animals that fill our environment. Right. Whether we're in 10,000 square feet,
I've been there.
Coming from a one-bedroom apartment into 10,000 square feet, eventually you will fill that space.
Right. And you want to make it nice too,
right?
Which it's not always when you get it from a builder. It may be builder quality. It's not been upgraded or whatever. And then you want to go in, like me, right, and upgrade 5 bathrooms.
Right.
That gets a little expensive.
It does, and it's the society and our culture that tells us that's what we need to do.
Right.
We need to keep up with the Joneses. We need to have the newest, biggest, flattest TV.
Hear it all day long. Yep.
And I think that's my biggest reason and my biggest motivation behind getting into tiny houses is getting away from a consumerist lifestyle.
Absolutely.
Where you look, just driving to work or, waking up in the morning, the first thing you do, turn your TV on, watching the news, and you're inundated with commercials and buy this. Save money on this. We're all about saving money, but they're not talking about how much money you actually spent.
Right.
People are going broke saving money.
Right. You didn't need to buy all that.
Right. And there's no reason you don't need it other than the fact that they tell you need it.
Right.
you don't have to be, it kills me seeing these videos of people fighting each other through Walmart on Black Friday just to get the newest, best TV, you know, at a better price. And
you think that would have scared people away?
You would think.
It scared me away.
You know, I mean, with all the, you can buy stuff on the internet now, and Amazon will walk it into your door for you.
Right.
You know, you don't need all that stuff. And then you look at how much stuff people are shoveling into their house, but look at the backyard and how much stuff is being shoveled out into the trash.
Right.
And how much stuff is being shoveled into these landfills.
Right.
Stuff that's still in decent shape potentially.
Right. Right.
You know, and it just it sickens me that that's where our culture and our society has gotten, is that it's a society of value rather than values. You know, you look at a person and they have the nice car and they have a nice house. Oh, he must be a good guy.
Right.
You know, he must be happy and successful.
Right. But if he's driving,
if he's driving a beater car,
Camry, whatever, you know.
Oh, there's not somebody I want to be associated with. But maybe he's the nicest guy in the world, and he just doesn't need these, you know, intricate things and these nice fancy
to make
things
him happy or satisfied.
To peacock to the world that you know, I'm successful because I have this this brand new car, and you know, well, maybe you're a piece of shit.
Right.
You know, you're a terrible human being, but you got all this money, so we idolize you.
Yep.
You know, and so that's what bugs me about that, and what got me into the tiny house world.
So I want to ask a question about the kind of going back to the co-op, because one thing I don't think we really talked about is maybe some of the attributes of the co-op. So you know, we've talked before about our vision, right? I mean, we mentioned before certainly some land to grow some vegetables in, and maybe some flowers. What other things, like maybe a community center?
I mean, so the garden is number one. Everyone we've ever talked to, having a community garden as well as their own private garden, that they can grow. That's been across the board what everybody seems to want. Nice part about that is the next thing that people want is like a community center, somewhere for everyone to gather. Whether that looks like, you know, a barn where you have, you know, meetings and gatherings.
A little pavilion maybe.
Little pavilion,
first,
absolutely. That's
depending
the
on
next
what weather, climate.
The nice part about that is with the community garden and private gardens, you can then have a farmer's market every weekend, and you can get together and you can prioritize who's growing what, and then they bring that together. When I was doing my garden the first time, I had no idea my potato plants were going to take up a 6-foot radius. I ended up having to tie them up and put sticks up to keep them up from falling over on my carrots. I am terrible at growing carrots, by the way, because I'm like, are they ready? Nope. Are they ready? Nope.
No, I know, it's really hard. Nope. You can't see them. Yeah, I do the same thing.
And so
you want instant.
You know, the bushes are there, but by the time they're like, oh yeah, they're ready, I've got one carrot left, because I've gone through the whole row.
I had a community garden a couple of years ago, and I had the same experience. Yeah. And did you say potatoes or tomatoes?
Potatoes, I did.
Really? Wow.
I had 6 potato plants.
With tomatoes.
Tomato plants. I had 27 tomato plants. I had 26 pepper plants. I had 6 potato plants. My favorite one to grow was the artichoke plant. I'd never seen one before. That was really fun to grow.
Yeah, those are really cool.
Basil was awesome because you go sit out on a nice summer day in the heat and you could smell it. Those were amazing.
So what else?
But it's another activity for people to come together in the garden and meet and greet. You know their name, you're talking to them, you know who your neighbors are. The community center serves several purposes. It's a great number idea. One, as a co-op, you need to have a board of directors running the co-op, and it's somewhere to meet for that. At the same time, some people I was talking to thought it'd be a really cool idea that every weekend people would show up and they'd have a potluck.
I think that
would be so cool.
So I think that's one of the coolest parts. I've even heard of some communities, not necessarily tiny home communities, but communities that will do that on a more frequent basis.
Absolutely. Yeah. And just being able to, especially if you're having people over, or if you're a single mother with kids and maybe there's a night that you can't cook, or you know, whatever, it's a nice thing for the community to do. You got several people that can come in and maybe have like a kitchen in your community center where, you know, people can come in and cook, or if you're having more people over for like a birthday or a holiday, you know, you've got a place that maybe you could like reserve. You know, similar to what like an apartment complex has. You know, they've got the nice community center, they got the pool table that nobody seems to use, and they got the whole They spend a whole lot of money on this stuff, and then nobody ends up actually using it because they're not technically a community. They're just in close quarters.
Right.
So that definitely.
It's interesting.
I don't see near enough, and come to think, I don't think I've ever seen a community with tiny home businesses.
Yeah.
Whether it's you are a tiny home builder, or you are a tiny home coffee shop, or a bookstore, or a yoga studio, or a brewery, or a convenience store, or whatever it is.
I'm surprised you don't see more tiny home businesses already.
Right.
Yeah. But that's a great idea for a community.
But to be on site in a community where it is completely self-sustaining.
Daycare, right?
Daycare, retirement center, daycare, mix those two.
Right.
There's been scientific studies of people that, they mix in a daycare with a retirement center, and the retirees are healthier and happier because they have the youth around, and they're not just sitting around playing euchre, watching, old school TV. It gives them,
Wheel of Fortune, right?
Wheel of Fortune, right? There you go. So mixing things in with that, and I mean, I think our vision that we've talked about initially is within an hour of Denver.
Sure.
Because not everybody has the luxury of being able to, get to your computer when you're at work.
Right, absolutely.
Some people still need to commute.
To go to work.
And making these so they're within a good proximity to a major metropolitan area is going to be key.
Right.
But not so far that they're, withdrawn. The trouble is the housing market. The land prices, the property prices are ridiculous, and that's what's causing this uproar. Is I can't afford to live where I work. In California, I heard people are living in their cars during the week just so they could be to work and not have to drive 3 hours because they can't afford to live in the community where they work.
Right.
That's a big thing that's happening in Colorado. People are moving into Colorado where they're moving from a place that the housing prices were originally very high. They sell their house, they come to Colorado with cash in hand, and they're able to buy these houses cash.
Right.
My brother's been trying to buy a house for several years, and he's getting beat out because he offered only $10,000 over asking price.
Right.
People are dropping cash on the barrelhead and going $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 over asking.
And then you have people like young families like my cousin that's trying to move up from Arizona, because of all the construction work. And, they're looking at leaving a $350,000 house and trying to replace it here.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't find anything for less than $400,000 unless it needs a lot of work probably right now.
Yeah, it's going to need a lot of work, and it's going to be a lot smaller.
Right.
If you're coming in with any size family.
And a pool they have now.
Oh, my God.
Probably not going to get a pool.
Not a pool. You fill your bathtub up.
Right, exactly. Exactly.
So that's another thing in the co-op that we want to address is the land values. Obviously, if that sweet spot's going to be like 45 minutes to an hour outside of town.
Sure.
Finding a piece of property that ideally would be in the mountains, that you can have some rolling hills, a creek rolling through it. Make it nice, something that tiny houses can be put up. There's not fences up everywhere. A dog park is a big one for a community. Putting in a dog park in there, having walking trails that are throughout the park. I mean,
you'd
think
have
of
the
this.
community to be involved in that, right?
Exactly.
I mean, they would have a vested interest.
Exactly.
Right? To make their property better.
Yeah. So consider 100 people come together. We want a tiny home community. You find a piece of property that's 100 acres. Right. On average, you put. I mean, let's go big. One house per acre.
Right.
That's everyone has an acre themselves.
Right.
Let's downsize that. Call it half an acre to each house, even a quarter acre to each house. That's still a lot of property for a tiny house. More than a lot of people with a single family home.
That's what I was going to ask. Yeah.
You get those people. Say everyone puts in $10,000. Right. This isn't including the house of the cost of the house itself.
Sure.
Right. This
That'd
is
be
just
nice.
getting into the land. Right. Wow. That's $1 million you put together. Everybody putting $10,000 in, 100 people, $1 million. You can buy a decent property for $1 million. Whether or not it's 100 acres is a different story.
Sure.
But I was looking up north of Boulder, and I had found one. Whether it would work for what we were trying to do, I hadn't gotten to that point.
Sure.
It got bought up before we got there, but it was 230 acres for $7,500 or $750,000.
Wow.
We get 100 people dropping $20,000 in there. We got $2 million for a 230 acre development.
Cost.
We now have money to put in the roads that we need, put in the sewer system we need, run the water, do all of the upgrades, a solar setup for the community, have your own solar array where everybody can come in and plug in.
Right.
Technically off-grid.
So now you have that off-grid or on-grid capability, right?
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Which a lot of people I don't think plan for either.
Not many, yeah.
They build tiny homes because
they want to be off-grid, but then if you look into the future of tiny homes, it's going to be in these community formations, and you're not going to be able to do a composting toilet with 100 people living in your close community.
Exactly.
It's a big pile of food.
Exactly. And there's, no, well said.
But the idea is the community aspect and having those amenities in the community that the community wants.
Right.
You know, obviously putting in a tennis court when nobody else plays tennis doesn't make any sense. But the nonprofit is focused on getting the difficult steps put together.
Right.
Getting your set of bylaws, getting your articles of incorporation.
A roadmap,
if you need that.
kind of.
A roadmap, getting you the resources put together, having that into the city council or the zoning department or the planning department, having potentially, a friend in the city council or in the zoning department that we can talk to, knowing those steps versus trying to, forge this project on your own. We would basically put together a roadmap and a template on here's the basics of a tiny home community, find the people, and potentially we will have the people in the nonprofit or be donators of it because we'll be sending out notices and having fundraisers and educational events and all sorts of stuff to raise awareness and raise money to get these communities going.
So eventually, I mean, what I see, which I think is just awesome, is these communities coming together, even in different, and like you said, they have their own board, right? And they make those decisions. If they want a tennis court, then
if you got 10 tennis players that want it, let's get a tennis court. But if everybody's a golfer,
right.
That doesn't
But I
make
also
any
see them
sense.
being like in even different areas. You mentioned like an hour of Denver Metro.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but and I grew up in the mountains like you did for a while, so I definitely have a love for the mountains.
For people that work in Parker,
but yeah, exactly.
That's a longer drive, so definitely being able to have that.
So now you have a roadmap, and you have people that can gather together in those areas of Metro Denver or whatever it is, and come together and say, hey, let's take what these guys put together as a committee, and let's build our own community.
Absolutely.
That's awesome. That's pretty cool. That's really cool.
And that's again, the nonprofit will be gathering those people together.
Right.
And then when we get to the point where we found somebody in city council, in the planning department, and they're very excited about what we're doing, and they're able to help us through that, or at least we're able to navigate that process, then we can go out to our constituents or members, or I guess they'd actually just be followers. We'll come up with the terminology for that later, however that goes.
Tiny home movers and shakers.
There you go, right? And be able to go out to them and say, okay, we've got something going on in Jefferson County. Who's in? We got something in Douglas County. We got something in Adams County, Arapahoe County, Chaffee County, wherever it is. And it's something that we can basically help them put together, let it hatch, let it grow, let it learn to fly, and let it go. I think that's going to be the future of this. The difference between what we're doing and what everyone else has been doing and what they've seen is they're taking the business model of what was done before, and they're trying to not reinvent the wheel, but they're just using that, and rightfully so. It's sometimes feasible, but the problem is when it is potentially feasible, but they're not getting the return on their investment that they're looking for, they'll scrap the project. Versus if we get a bunch of people where their main bottom line is a nice community to live in and park my tiny home, when they achieve that, and you start to see a dividend check at the end of the year for stuff that's going on in the community,
Right.
it starts to make sense, and that's what we want people to start to see is this is really supporting the lifestyle versus just another way for consumerism and capitalism to take hold and profit from something that people are trying to get away from that in the first place.
Right. And you talk about getting some kind of benefit as far as being like a dividend you mentioned. I always thought it would be cool, and we've talked about it, to have like maybe a small area on the property where you have 10 or 12 tiny homes where people could stay, and then the community benefits and the revenues from those rentals or whatever, or even some empty spots where when somebody's passing from Maine to California and wants to stop in Colorado for a month, they've got a place to park their tiny home.
Yeah, and that's going to come down to how we set up the communities. Maybe we can have a portion of it be RV type parking, and then allow
close
them
to
come
town,
in.
right? Close to the barber shop and the.
I mean, you
the
could
things
have
we talked
different.
about.
You could have different spots. Yeah,
Right,
you could have one where it's in town. You've got like the Old West downtown. You've got Main Street, people walking around saying hi, and then you can have a spot right in downtown. Live in this tiny house. You can rent it out on Airbnb.
Right.
And
downtown.
then somebody's job that's in the community is taking care of these
that.
Airbnb.
Yep. And they get paid for that. Plus, they benefit from
And the portion of those
dividend
proceeds
check
go
or
to the community.
the community. Right.
Another idea we were talking about was right now there is no essentially there's no used market for tiny houses, right? There are a few places that people will build a tiny house and place it, and you can stay in it, and if you decide yes, it's for sale.
Right.
But having something like that, where essentially it's like a used lot of tiny houses, you can come in, rent them out. They're rented out just like
test
Airbnb.
drive it.
Test drive it. If you like it, you can take it home, and then we could consign that for people that are in the community that I've got to move to Florida for work.
That's a great idea.
My mother's sick and I've got to go back out to Arizona, whatever it is, and they can no longer take care of their tiny house.
Sure.
Maybe they can put it up for sale and at the same time be making an income, and the community can be making some income off of renting that out.
Right.
Or in the other story would be they have to move out of town for maybe a couple months to a year, something like that, but they don't want to get rid of their tiny house.
Right.
We could rent it out for them.
Yeah.
And manage that, again, coming back to the community.
As a community
the
that they
homeowner
live
get
in and trust.
a profit from it.
Yeah, that's cool.
There's a lot of different ways that you can do that, but really it's going to come down to in that specific community. This isn't something that we're going to be able to do nationwide all at once.
Right.
It's got to be something slow. Take it one community at a time, but we're just trying to get away from that capitalism, consumerism lifestyle that.
Looking forward to it
stuck in.
happening. Yeah, absolutely.
That could be cool.
Yep. What else haven't we covered? What else haven't we talked about?
I got what is the tiny house movement about? I think we talked about that. How to start.
Yeah, I mean, so
how to get into the.
You and I talked a little bit about that before.
Hey, Scott and Ryan, I'm thinking of getting into a tiny house. What do I do first?
Downsize. Get rid of your stuff. Get your financing in order. Think of what's important to you, right? What in your design. Because everybody's different. I think that's one of the cool things about tiny homes is you can design it around your lifestyle. I think one thing people don't realize about tiny homes, we talked about cost a little bit before, is that you have basically the same features in a tiny home that you'd have in a regular home, just in a condensed spot. So I think we touch a little bit on the cost of tiny homes, and or at least selling used tiny homes. But I think some people don't realize that it is, from a square footage basis, it's more costly.
Absolutely, you have all the
you don't have all that floor
features, the
space that you
amenities,
don't
the
use.
appliances, all of the mechanics
Right.
that are in a normal single-family home.
Sure.
Just spread across a smaller square footage, so your costs per square footage, expect them to be much higher.
Yep. And then everything has to, hopefully has 2 or 3 uses, right?
Oh yeah, multiple uses inside the house.
Right. I think that's one of the fascinating things is the design.
That's probably my favorite part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Just especially working with and listening to people and what it is that they need, you know, for their tiny home. And everybody's different. You don't find, you know, one person the same. So that's really cool.
What I like about it is a lot of people that I've talked to 2, 3, 4 years ago, talked to them about tiny houses. They're like, oh, I could never live in a tiny house. And they're coming up to us, you know, several years later, like, so can you build me a tiny house?
Right.
And it's because it plants that seed, and when people hear about it, that's why it's so popular on, you know, the TV networks of the tiny house shows.
Yep.
Is people love seeing, obviously, the tiny houses.
Right.
But it's planting that seed in their head where they're like, oh, okay, tiny houses is just a fad, it's just a thing.
Right.
And then they go in and they start looking around their own house, and they're like, you know, I have a lot of space here. You know, I haven't been in that bedroom since I bought the place.
Right.
And then it starts planting a seed. Maybe I don't need all this stuff. And that thought process keeps continuing. And so changing your thoughts, downsizing your thoughts, and then start downsizing your stuff, I think, is the very first step, is like really understand what's going to be involved.
Right.
Because that's like half the show on some of those shows that's on TV.
Oh,
It's, let's build your house.
Put all your stuff on your king-size bed, and that's what you get to take with you.
And that's half the show, is them being like, well, I need 18 moisturizers to come with me. You know, it's like, you really only need the one.
Yeah.
You know, and it's our society that it just, we're supposed to have all this stuff. And, you know,
And take it from me, you don't need it. And I think you said the same thing too. Is, you know, we both been there before.
Yeah.
And it's again liberating just to not have all that stuff and not have to think, you know, oh, I gotta fix the upright vac this week. I can use the canister vac, you know, or whatever. I could almost do the floors without a vacuum in a tiny home if I had to, right?
Yeah. I mean, the ones that we build, you don't even need a vacuum.
Right.
I mean, it depends on your kids, I suppose.
I like the
if you have
vacuum, though,
kids.
so we better get off that subject.
Get the Swiffer.
Yeah. Oh, I love the Swiffer.
See, there you go.
Awesome.
But yeah, there's a lot of people out there that, you know, they're making that transition. They're getting into the idea of that lifestyle. But I think that's the biggest step, is the changing your thoughts, changing your mentality about what's been shoved down our throats by media, by commercials, by radio. You know, it's just inundated with buy this, save money here, you know.
Sure.
Buy one, get one free. It's like, well, I didn't want one. Why would I want another one for free?
Right.
Changing that mentality. Like, it's a diagnosable, psychological, I don't know what the actual term is, but
that
like,
occurs
that, you know, they're like hoarders. There's a TV show called Hoarders. Like people that think they have to collect stuff.
I don't understand it.
Like it wasn't. I can pretty much. I can
feel
guarantee
for those people, though, definitely.
Cavemen were not like, I gotta have that rock, and I need like 8 other rocks just like it. You know, and they're just filling their cave with stuff. It wasn't. That's not how we were.
Right.
How we're wired. We're not supposed to just have all of this stuff.
Right.
And
what is it doing for you, other than, to me, making your life more?
That's what they're telling you, is that this stuff is going to make you happy. This stuff is going to make you feel fulfilled.
Right.
There's this hole in my soul that I need to fill it with stuff. You know, and then I remember I was flipping a house for a guy that, or no, it was an apartment complex. And we were trying to get the guy from one apartment to another so that he was going into a brand new fixed up apartment, and we had to get his stuff out so that we could fix his apartment and then into another one.
Sure.
But he was a hoarder. He had
This is an apartment.
This is an apartment.
Right.
It was one of those where you walk in and there's hallways of newspaper, and it's just like this. And stuff everywhere, right? And he'd go out, and every time we saw him, he was unloading more stuff, because he would go to garage sales and flea markets. And, well, why'd you get the boxes? Well, like, I got other boxes I got to put in the box. You know, and I have stuff to put stuff in, stuff to store stuff, and it's just, there's too much stuff. And so we told him, okay, we're going to get all of your stuff out, and we'll put it into one of those storage pods, right? And we moved all of his stuff out, We got the place cleaned up, and in 2 weeks' time, we were going to move him to this other unit, and
Right.
we were going to unload his stuff.
Right.
We weren't going to.
Right.
He is free to unload
Right.
his stuff.
Hope he was in good
2
shape.
weeks. 2 weeks we came back. We're like, okay, we're ready to move you, and you're good to go. He had refilled his entire apartment,
Wow.
floor to ceiling, with more stuff.
So now he owned a
because
storage
for him,
unit.
it was unacceptable living in that space.
Yeah.
He had to fill it with
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
And in 2 weeks' time, he had doubled the amount of stuff that he had.
Right.
And it just...
It's sad. I mean, it makes me think of storage units.
Yeah.
Which I've heard stories that, there's more storage units than there are McDonald's and Starbucks in the world combined or something like that. And it's just like, and people and I can honestly say I've never had a storage unit. But I've known lots of people who have. And, sometimes they don't look at it for 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
And then they go back to it and they find it's just a bunch of boxes of
It's just stuff.
that
It's not.
they'll probably never, they didn't need, obviously, because it's
Yeah.
been sitting there for 3 years. But
You see another show,
Yeah.
there's Storage Wars
Storage
or whatever
Wars,
it
yeah,
is,
yeah,
and they go
yeah.
through,
I
and they really probably only show you the ones that there is some good stuff.
Right,
But how
right.
many of these storage units do they go through where they're like, I just paid $1,000 for
boxes of
old
paper.
medical records
Yeah,
and
exactly.
yearbooks for some guy I never knew.
Exactly.
You know, and it just there's too much
Yeah.
of that, and the media and our society just shoving it down our throats that you need to buy stuff, you need to go into debt, you
Right.
need to work so you pay your taxes so you can continue this
Right.
this cycle of financial slavery.
So what started? So do you think that's part of the reason, in your opinion, that tiny homes really became an attractive? I mean, like, what really started it years ago?
I mean,
Any
I don't.
thoughts?
There's a lot of different stories. The
Right.
one I know of, I'm not going to name drop or anything, but there's somebody decided to build a tiny house that was a better quality than an RV,
Okay.
and wanted something that he could travel around with.
Sure.
He didn't want to get into a 30-year mortgage.
So you don't think it was like a zombie apocalypse type situation where people are like,
I mean, I feel like
we
that
need
was
a tiny home to get to the mountains.
Right.
It needs to be on wheels so we can get out of here quick.
right.
We need
that
a
would be-
rooftop deck on our tiny home too, so that we can.
You gotta have the overlook. You gotta
absolutely.
be able to
You gotta
see what's
see
coming.
what's coming.
right? Yeah. I think that's in the back of people's minds in this day and age. Is
Yeah.
this
Wouldn't surprise me with what's going on.
this
in the
collapse
world.
of our current regime, of
Right.
our culture and everything is.
Right.
There's so many different avenues that it could come from. That the president running our country into the ground, North Korea bombing us, Russia doing whatever they're doing to mess up our voting, the fights with civilians and police, zombie apocalypse, the poisoning,
Biochemical
warfare.
warfare. Yeah.
I mean, and then just the stuff that's going on in the real world. But then you look at what's really popular in movies and what people are watching. Ton of apocalypse, like end of the world type stuff.
Right.
Marvel Comics having all these movies where somebody's coming down from outer space and blowing up the world, and we all got to come together. Zombie apocalypse stuff, Walking Dead.
And this is what kids are.
This is
grown
what
up.
and
yeah.
grown-ups are
And
watching.
grown-ups,
This is
right.
everybody's like, the world's coming to an end. I think that's in the back of everybody's mind as well. As there's something's got to give at some point.
Well, I honestly think it'd be cool to have like a container home that you bury underground, and then you roll your tiny home over it.
Bomb shelter.
And then you got two. You got your permanent home and you got your
Yeah.
temporary home. So.
Yeah. I think that would be amazing. And then that's something you could use these containers for, is they're
Right.
surrounded by the dirt and the
Right.
insulation.
Because they're
doesn't
not always
become an
that
issue.
pretty, even
Right.
though I do support it, obviously, as a supporter of the tiny home movement. But yeah, they little short on the head space sometimes, and
Right.
not the most attractive. So.
And that's something that people, I think, in a lot of those zombie apocalypse shows, the apocalypse shows, and I mean even the news, you see it in real life, and
Sure.
the issue is not what's going on, or that it's the other people that are involved. It's if something did happen, being able to protect yourself, being in a community that's working together,
Right.
willing to look after each
Right.
other. There's a sense of security and safety in that.
Right.
Obviously, taking this to the extreme with the zombie apocalypse and everything,
But another good reason for a community, right?
Yeah. Right.
Not only a tiny
you
home,
go.
but a tiny home community.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly. If Walking Dead was any kind of like how-to manual, it's stick together,
Right.
find a community.
Right.
How many walkers have you killed? How many
Right.
people have you killed, and why?
Right.
Maybe we should ask those questions or something similar to get people into these communities.
Exactly. Exactly.
How much stuff do you have? How much stuff have you gotten rid of, and why?
Right. Right.
Maybe a reason to vet people coming in
Sure.
there. But
Sure.
yeah, I think that
Uh,
there's some sort of doomsday idea in the back of people's minds that I think plays a part, because there is that segment of people that are doomsday preppers. And,
Oh, yeah.
they're getting
I mean,
ready for it, and they think the end is nigh. And
Right. Everybody's got their reasons, and there's definitely many of those people out there too. You
Yeah.
know, there's, and that's another cool thing about tiny homes is you see every different occupation imaginable.
Mhm. Coming into this,
coming
if they were
into
all
this.
Boy Scouts, be prepared. And that's what they're trying for. So
Right.
it's cool to see. It's exciting to see the movement take shape and turn into a full-fledged industry, and it turn into
Yeah, it's happening.
my concern and the reason I think that we both had the same vision is taking it in that direction, that this is a lifestyle that we want to support, not
Right.
just another industry to make a ton of money
Right.
on.
Absolutely.
I don't think we went into the tiny home industry thinking we're going to be billionaires.
No. No.
But it's
We would
want to
have
support.
built big homes then.
Right. Yeah. We want to support that lifestyle,
Right.
the sustainable, the repeatable, the little bit more natural, but not turning our back on technology. I think we've come a long way
Sure.
with technology. We definitely want to incorporate that into these, but not letting it take over our lives, I think is going to be important. So,
You'll have space to go outside now.
yeah,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, get outside, get your face out of the computer, or off the laptop, or whatever.
So we started talking about design before.
Yep.
And there are definitely some intricacies of building a tiny home versus your standard, single-family home that most people live in these days. So let's talk about some of those, I guess.
Yeah, design elements that are different, or
Sure.
somewhat different than standard.
Is it smaller?
Definitely smaller. I'd say one of the major aspects of a tiny house that's different from a normal house is, instead of like a second story, you basically got a loft.
Right.
Obviously, if you're going to put it on wheels, you have size constraints. You're 8.5 feet wide, 13.5 feet tall, or depending on your state, the height, and then limited to a certain length depending on what your tow
Right,
vehicle is.
right.
But with those constraints, utilizing as much space on the interior as possible is important. So putting bedrooms in a loft is pretty popular.
What about people like me that may be more experienced and knowledgeable that don't want to climb up a ladder or a stairway?
You've had your fill of stairs and ladders, yeah.
Yeah,
that's
some of my
something really
experiences,
popular.
I think, with ladders at least. We shouldn't talk about this now.
No, it's one of the major demographics of our clientele
Sure.
that comes in is empty nesters, retirees that are wanting to downsize the amount of space that they just have to clean.
Yours truly.
Right.
Yeah.
Somebody that they don't have the kids at home anymore, and they don't have the big family events and stuff like that, so they could deal with a smaller size house. One of those things that they're taking into account is their ability later on to navigate the stairs, to just want to do the stairs or a ladder.
Right.
And so a lot of times they're wanting to put the bedroom on the main floor,
Sure.
which is really popular these days. A lot of times maybe you'll have the bedroom on the main floor and then a loft for if you've got younger kids, depending on. We've got clients on site right now. As you know, the family of 5 that are building a big tiny house.
Yeah.
It's 41 feet
41
long.
feet long.
Gooseneck. They've got 3 kids.
Yep.
And so they've got to have their own main bedroom, their master bedroom, and then they've got a kind of a connected loft that is for their toddler, and then the 2 boys are in the backside that have their own loft.
Catwalk,
all
right?
connected by a catwalk
Which sounds
overhead,
so cool.
which is going to
Yeah.
be super
Yeah.
cool. But it's things like that number one, I love about tiny houses is the fact that they're designing this around their lifestyle
Right.
versus somebody else building it and saying, hopefully you can fit in this box.
Right.
It's
And-
really thinking outside of the box mentality with this.
And the gooseneck allows, in this case, for them to be able to stand up in their gooseneck portion above the
Yeah, that's a major issue with the lofts is
and stairs.
you
instead
want
of,
you
Sure.
want the height at the bottom floor with code.
Mhm.
The way the code is written,
Right.
if you're following that, you're limited to 6'8",
Right.
unless you're over like a bathroom or a kitchen or something like that,
Right.
and then you're down to 6'4". But
Right.
even then, it's still a limitation, and then that leaves you only so much height that you can go for that upper loft. So a lot of times you're crouching down, depending on your roof style, will severely limit the amount of space you have
Sure.
up there as well. And so that gooseneck is a very popular option,
Right.
because it's not as high as a regular loft would be, and you're allowed to you can put a few steps up to it.
Sure.
You still got to
Sure.
kind of climb up to it.
I think I could handle that one.
It's like 4 steps, yeah. Obviously, if we're trying to make a handicap accessible, we wouldn't
Right.
want to go with the gooseneck.
Right.
We just have everything on the main floor.
Right.
You just have to kind of spread it out a little bit more.
Yeah.
But things like that, and then that brings into play like what you brought up earlier, the multifunction of things that go into a house. If you put stairs into the house, they should be storage, or they
Sure.
should be
Sure.
seating, or they should have another job besides just taking up space and getting you up to the loft.
Absolutely.
Ladders, a lot of times, they're nice because they can hide away, or they can be put away or stored and not take up space. I've seen countertops that also operate as part of the stairway going up.
That
as the-
scares me just a
which
little
is kind of
bit.
weird if you're stepping on your countertop.
Yeah, I
it
have
could
a
be, as long as you got like a shoes off
yeah
rule
policy.
in the house. I love the idea of like a spice rack coming out of the ceiling of the
Sure,
loft.
sure.
You've got that space. We always say in tiny houses, it's not about square feet, it's about square inches.
Right.
You only have so much space, and you got to utilize
Absolutely.
every inch that you've got. So taking advantage of any space that's available to use for whatever purpose. Storage, probably the number one
Right.
thing that people complain about, whether they're in a tiny house, thinking about going into a tiny house, or just, dismissing the entire idea of a tiny house because they couldn't store their 700 pairs of shoes or whatever it is.
But there's ways that if that's really what you want to do, store 700 pairs of shoes, I'm sure we could figure out a way to.
We'll build you a trailer for just your shoes.
Just your
Absolutely,
shoes.
it'll match your tiny house, and it'll be great.
Yeah. So no, I think the gooseneck is a great option. Obviously, when you're talking tiny homes on wheels, you've got the gooseneck and the bumper pull, I guess you'd call it, right? Which is kind of the standard. But what do you think some of the advantages and disadvantages between those two are? I mean, because other than a tiny home that's going to be on a foundation or a container home or a schoolie or something like that, right?
Right.
I mean, that's going to be one of your first decisions.
Is whether you want to go bumper pull or the the gooseneck.
Right.
The gooseneck, it allows you to go a little bit heavier. The majority of your weight is going to be taken by whatever axles you have. So if you have a really long trailer, you're going to have probably a triple axle.
Sure.
And depending on the weight capacity of those axles is really going to dictate what you can pull.
Right.
The downside to a gooseneck trailer is you've got to have a truck that is capable of pulling a gooseneck, but that's usually not difficult. If you've got a truck big enough to pull any size load that your tiny house would be, it's very simple to add the hitch in the back of the truck to pull that. The things that are nice about goosenecks is your maneuverability with it, especially when you're talking about parking your tiny house. It is much easier to maneuver a gooseneck because of the range of motion that your tow vehicle has, especially when you're backing it up.
Right.
The thing to think about when you're towing a gooseneck is your tires are no longer going to follow the track of your tow vehicle.
It's like
tires.
one of those big semi-trailers where you see the little sign on the back, you know.
Wide turns.
Yeah,
you got to take wide turns, and you're still
turns.
even sometimes going to be, if you're not a professional,
right,
CDL qualified driver.
Which is a whole other subject, because sometimes
hit the curb.
Yeah, and then sometimes I think you want those drivers.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Hopefully not one that hits a curb.
Right. But though you got to keep that in mind that your tires are you got to take much bigger turns so that you can do that. But when you're talking about backing it up, you can do a jackknife turn and turn it completely across.
Right.
Versus in a gooseneck, you're going to be limited to that that amount of movement. They are easier to drive when you're going forward. They tend to follow your tracks of the tow vehicle tires a lot better, so you don't have to take as wide of turns.
Right.
But the other thing to consider, though, is it adds to the length of the actual tow situation,
right?
Your tow vehicle and your trailer.
Sure.
So you're going to be limited to the amount of space you have. In Colorado, we're limited to 65 feet from the bumper of the tow vehicle to the bumper to the tail of the trailer.
So you only get about a 40-some foot trailer?
Essentially,
I think that'd be enough for
on
me.
average, your tow vehicle is about 20-some feet, 25 feet, depending on the truck.
Right, you got your...
And then when we talk about, say you got a 28-foot trailer, you've got 4 feet of tongue that is not calculated into that. So you've got to take that into account. Versus a gooseneck, you've got tiny house parts that are over the tow vehicle. So you've got more space to utilize with the same size trailer.
So what about structure? I mean, so, there's... The things I've learned are since being in the tiny home business, you have your SIPs, right? Your structural insulated panels. You have your metal framing. You have your wood framing. I think there's advantages and disadvantages with each. But I certainly, think that, metal, for instance, is lighter in weight, right? So that can be a big thing when you're on wheels. Maybe not as important if you're building on a foundation.
If you're on a foundation, it's not as important. The reason that a lot of tiny houses are built with wood is because that's what the industry standard was before tiny houses came about. We were building with wood. That's what people know. That's what they're comfortable with.
Still used a lot.
Yeah. Uh-oh.
I think I lost mine hours. But yeah, no, I think...
You still hear me? Cool.
Yeah, wood is, it's just what's known, right?
It's what's known. It's what everybody's comfortable with using. And right now, the price of it is cheaper than any other product right now. But what you need to take into account is the labor. There's more labor involved when dealing with the wood.
We found out that. I know some people may not understand that.
Yeah, and if you're building it yourself and you're not worried about paying for the labor, not as big of a deal. But really, the structure comes into play at that point. Is making sure that you are building these correctly and the right amount of spacing between your studs, the right amount of support for your windows with your trimmers and your headers and everything going on, and just making sure that the racking is going to be sturdy enough because. I think the saying is, living in a tiny house, going down the road is like being in a tornado and a hurricane at the same time. Or, I'm sorry, an earthquake and a hurricane at the same time. So these things, the racking is way more than what any other home would be, normal home would be subject to. The weight factor is a huge factor for wood. That's where steel came into play was, trying to reduce the amount of weight that these things are at, because you do have a limitation according to what how many axles you have and what their weight capacity is.
And a lot of that steel is recycled too.
Yeah,
which is nice.
I mean, it's adds to the
environmental.
Yeah, what the benefits of going into this and people like the idea of that. Steel is harder to work with. You've got to have your plans set up. If something changes, you basically have to change your entire layout for that wall, depending on if you're cutting your beams yourself on site, then it's not as big of an issue. But if you're going through, a pre-rolled out set of plans and your tiny house basically comes in a kit, which is what we do. Then if you change something, you got to rechange,
Right.
Address the entire wall at that point.
Right.
So planning comes into play, making sure that you're up to date. But it's about a third of the weight that we're talking about with wood. The labor goes down because they go together much easier if you're talking about these kits that are
Sure.
pre-cut, pre-made.
For us old school people like me, although I've heard you use the term erector set, right?
Yeah.
Did you actually?
I had erector sets.
You
I
did?
had Lego
Wow,
sets. I
okay.
had Lincoln logs. Yeah.
Yeah, me too.
I'm right in that, right in between those, the millennials and the
You were fortunate because those were three of my favorite
Generation Y
toys.
and X and, my generation, we had the life where there were no computers, and there were, you were doing the rotary phone, and then now living in where we're at with, everybody has a cell phone. But yeah, it is essentially like a big kit erector set. It goes together much easier. It changes a little bit of how things are attached and how you do the trades after that, because you're not using your normal nail gun and just pounding these things into the wood studs, and if you mess up, you pull it out and start over. It's not as forgiving. So there are a lot of materials that are coming out that are being engineered and produced to address this. SIPs being one that was already engineered and produced before tiny houses came about, but they realized that this might be something that would be advantageous to it, which they're great. They're just very expensive.
Right.
They can cut the wall and have it pre-made for your design, and you just put these walls together and you tie them together, and you're good to go. Again, very little in labor cost, but the material price is still very high.
Right.
At this point.
What I know as far as roof designs, right? So, just continue to talk about the structure, right? We have the framing, and then of course, you're at some point gonna put the structure together, of course, and then you have different design elements such as the like the roof line, for instance.
Yeah. So the roof line, you've got certain
Gable.
Limitations again because of your size and your height and your weight. But there are essentially three basic roof pitches that you can do, or roof styles. You've got a flat roof. Not many people are real keen on that.
Surprises me a little bit.
Surprises me, but it doesn't because of the experience coming into the tiny houses. There's a lot of people that go into tiny houses come from a residential construction background or no construction background. And they think that you have to have a pitch to your roof, and they don't realize that 1% is a pitch. And it still feels flat when you're up on it. But it's still pitch.
And
all you need is enough for the water to run off.
And it's 8.5 foot wide. Usually.
Yeah. And so when you're talking about a location like Colorado, your snow load doesn't really come into play because it's only 8.5 feet wide. Most snow load tests are done on a 12-foot span. So with the way that these are engineered and the way that they're built, normally you're not going to have an issue with your snow load, whether it's wood, steel, SIPs, anything like that. When you talk about the next pitch or the next style of roof would be a shed roof, where essentially it's a flat roof that's taken and put at an angle.
Some degree.
It drains easier. Obviously, the more pitch you have, the easier for snow and water to run off, which is important. It's also one of the easiest to build. As far as technical, the easiest is the flat roof, obviously. It's squares.
But like you said, I think a lot of people just aren't familiar with it in the construction industry, standard construction industry. I mean, you look at single-family homes, you don't see a lot of flat roofs. Maybe in New Mexico.
Yeah,
certainly
the weather,
not here in Colorado.
And that's why I think a lot of them don't really transfer into the tiny homes, because they think you have to have a pitched roof, like a steep pitch roof in Colorado because of the snow. But
and depending on how
you're not going to have that much snow on
and
the
depending
roof.
on how you have to park your tiny home, And if you want to do solar, which
Mm-hmm.
I think would be a good idea in many cases. When
Solar
you have a
allows
tiny
you,
home on
yeah,
wheels.
a flat roof allows you the most
But if you have
real
a
estate.
gable roof,
Yeah.
which I don't know if you got to mention yet, but the gable roof, I mean, you'd have to orient it a certain way, and then even then you're going to lose half your surface space.
Right.
Right. Which
Not essentially half. The next style is the gable roof,
Right.
and depending on what pitch you're going to
true.
do,
True.
it's not going to be half your
Right.
size, because if you go with a steeper pitch, you've got a longer run in your roof
That's
space.
a good point. Yeah.
But it is going to severely limit your availability
As
of
far as
the
how you
array of
orient it.
solar that you're going to do, and it limits your orientation. If you're in Colorado, you want a
Sure.
42-degree facing south
Right.
is for the best
Yep.
the best degree of sunlight. But if you are on a property and they have forced you to be north-south or east-west, whatever, if you're facing, the front of your trailer has to face north-south, now you've only got east or west facing
Sure.
solar panels, so
Sure.
you're only getting half the sunlight.
Sure. Yeah.
So definitely something to keep in mind. I think there's an aesthetic value to the gable roof, as well as the utility of the drain.
No, I
draining.
agree. Yeah.
The issue is it takes a lot of space out of the interior of the home. If you have a really steep pitch roof, it takes away the ability to have that loft up top.
Right.
That's when you see the lower pitched roofs,
Right.
like a 112, 212,
Right.
something like that.
Right. Yeah, otherwise your loft is just going to be a triangle, basically.
Right, and then the only place you can stand up is like right in the middle, and you're
Not stand up, probably, but yeah.
Yeah, you can maybe be able to kneel. Yeah.
Yeah.
So being able to maximize that interior space, that's why we're
Yep.
focusing and trying to do shed roofs, but I think they just look a little awkward. You got one high side, one low side, but it does offer the easiest and best situation for drainage aside from the gable roof, which takes up too much space, I think.
Well, I think you and I are both a big fan of the flat roof. They're built pretty well, or at least the tiny homes.
Ours are.
Yeah, we build are built well, and there's lots of space up on there. So if you do need
in
to,
Colorado, we
yeah,
have so much
yeah,
sun. Why not put a rooftop deck
yeah.
up there and enjoy the sun?
Yeah, it reminds
when
me
you
of
got
my
it.
NASCAR days when somebody had a schoolie down there many years ago before tiny homes were even a thing, and they had a rooftop deck on the schoolie, just the whole thing.
Yeah.
And it was a lot of fun.
Yeah. I bet.
Good time. So.
But yeah, those are the main design elements for the roof.
Sure.
Obviously, you can do a rooftop deck. Takes a little bit more engineering and making sure that you've got the runoff that you need. If you're going with a flat pitch roof, and you've got to have a little bit of an angle because
Sure.
you don't want flat, you don't want ponding or pooling
Right.
on the roof, obviously. But having somewhat of a pitch, it just takes a little bit more engineering. Obviously, you're going to
Sure.
want rails of some sort. Keep yourself on the roof.
Yeah, I would say that's very important.
And then that kind of brings into the question of exterior materials.
Sure.
There's all sorts of the standard materials that go on normal houses. Some of them, because of their characteristics, kind of put themselves out of the realm of possibilities for a tiny house.
Right.
Fiber cement board, for example.
Kind of heavy.
Hardy siding is super heavy. It's concrete
right,
board.
Right. And flexibility-wise, right?
Flexibility, it has some flex to
When you're
it.
traveling down the road.
Yeah.
I mean, like you mentioned before, an earthquake and a hurricane at the same time. I mean,
Yeah.
but
they're anticipating you get a hailstorm, and it's gonna,
True.
you get big enough hail, it's gonna,
Right.
crush your siding.
Right.
It is probably the most durable out there, but it is one of the heaviest,
Right.
which is unfortunate because it would be cool to put on a tiny house,
Sure.
But
So what else do you have?
the next step, I guess the most popular right now would be wood siding of some sort, TNG, beetle kill, stuff like that, cedar, and then just mixed into the design.
Right.
A lot of times what you see is people mixing their roofing materials into that,
Sure.
into the siding, just, give it some pizzazz. Other times it's because they ordered too much, or maybe they got a
Right.
discount and got some extras and put it in there,
Right.
and they had it available.
Right.
Corrugated steel is pretty inexpensive. A lot of
Yeah,
people doing
very
that
popular. Yep.
in their designs. That brings us into steel or aluminum siding.
Sure.
Very lightweight. very durable. A lot of times those will offer a warranty of some sort after you do the install. Obviously, if making sure that the install is according to manufacturer's specifications. But they'll offer some sort of warranty in most cases. Whereas the wood, the only guarantee they make is that it will deteriorate.
Right.
You know, you've got certain sealants and protective coatings you can put on these.
Right.
But essentially, it's out in the elements, and wood deteriorates. It's a scientific fact. It's going to happen. So you've got to treat your house basically every year, every 2 years, and then after about 10 to 15 years, you got to replace it. Versus, you know, aluminum siding, the siding that we use or that we like to use, has a 15-year warranty with it. You know, and there's steel products out there that have a long warranty as well.
And I think
the only work you have to do maybe is every now and then, you know, hose it down.
Right. Get the pressure sprayer out. Right.
You're not treating it. You're not painting it. You're not doing any of that.
When you think, you know, from my background in purchasing, you think of like total cost of ownership, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe a little more at the beginning to afford that aluminum siding, but think of not having to refinish it every year, replace it every 10 or 15. I mean, that will add up pretty fast.
Absolutely. So, taking those into account down the road is absolutely going to be beneficial for sure.
So
I mean,
roofing,
we could go
a lot
through,
of time, metal, I think. I mean, we could probably bore people
roofing,
with the
you're looking at, most popular right now is metal.
Right. Probably not going to
whether
have
it's
asphalt
corrugated
shingles
steel
on there,
or
right?
fiberglass. Did you say fiberglass?
No, I said you're
shingles,
probably
or?
not going to have asphalt shingles.
Oh, asphalt
right?
shingles? No, they're just too heavy.
They're going to fly off. They're
and
too
then
heavy.
You drive them down the road.
In the hurricane.
And they'll be flapping around. There are some flat roof application materials out there.
Sure.
Excuse me. Right now, most popular is hands down steel roofing of some sort. Usually, it's like the Pro Panel style, the raised ridge.
Sure.
It's a fairly easy install depending on your roof situation and what your roof line looks like. After that,
move inside.
Wood shingle I've seen. Which is still a weight. Steel, I think, is probably the number one. Our aluminum siding will go on the roof. You can have a fully encapsulated, which also doubles as a patio, so you can walk
in a flat roof
situation. Looks really nice. There's a couple options for that, and then you get more options the flatter you go.
Right.
I think there are only so many things that you can put on a roof that are gonna do their job.
Absolutely.
And withstand the hurricane earthquake effects that these tiny houses are subject to. So.
Definitely a lot of weather elements in Colorado. I mean, we're fortunate that we don't have hurricanes, things like that, but we do have lots of sun.
Yeah. But if you're on the road,
I don't know if
we got hurricanes every day.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
So moving inside, I think a big question that we always get is insulation.
Right.
Insulation is a big topic right now.
So after you get all your rough-in plumbing, your rough-in electrical, then
you're looking at what your insulation is, and depending on the material you use for your framing is going to dictate what you can and cannot use for insulation. Right now, the market or the industry of standard building is closed cell foam or open cell foam insulation, which basically it's an expanding foam agent that fills all the cracks and crevices in a home, which is really nice because when I was doing inspections on homes and doing the energy audits, looking at the insulation installs that they do, even professionals get it wrong. When you're trying to get a do-it-yourselfer to insulate it, they see insulation up and they think it's good.
Right.
They don't really understand what it's actually doing and the purpose for it.
Right.
And so there's normally gaps. There's insulation that's packed in when it should be allowed to be its full depth.
Right.
There are corners that are uninsulated. A big issue with tiny houses right now is not insulating the floor or around the wheel wells and allowing those air gaps to happen and that transfer of energy.
What do we use that term a lot? The thermal envelope, right?
The thermal envelope is basically, you got to think about it as a box.
Yeah.
And you have to have every side of that box sealed up, and every crease in between those sides needs to be sealed up. So it's basically an airtight box.
Yep.
When you're talking about just creating a shell over the box and there's nothing under the box, that's when you start seeing pipes freezing and people complaining about the floor being really cold.
Right. I've slept in the car before, and it's colder than sleeping on the ground in a tent.
Same idea.
Same idea.
Same idea. Yeah. You've got that loss of energy from the heat loss that you're losing from down below.
Yeah.
So spray foam is really popular. The issue with that is there's people out there that are concerned that there's off-gassing and chemicals coming into the home. And I will say the only issue with that is there are not enough studies to confirm. And so what we tell our clients is, if it's something that is of concern to you, let's look at other options. Right. If you're not concerned about it, let's not worry about it.
Right.
It does such a good job. It has such a good R value in it. It adds structurability to the home. It seals up the gaps really well. It acts as a vapor barrier. The closed cell foam does. So it just has a lot of benefits to it. If it's in the back of your mind that maybe it's off-gassing, let's think of something else, because last thing you want is to be concerned about that later on down the road when you're in your house.
Right.
There are not enough studies done to confirm or deny it right now.
Right.
That's where the concern is in the industry.
Right. And I think sometimes when, just if I was out there looking at it, and saw when they were installing it, right, and they're dressed up like, in white
they're in a hazmat suit, essentially.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but there is, during the actual installation, there's a reason for
there's
that.
There's a
but
chemical reaction
it
happening. Yeah.
Dries and it seals itself.
And you hear stories, horror stories. My kids were poisoned, blah blah blah.
Right.
Well, the one story that I heard about that was like the kids were asleep while they were spraying it.
Yeah.
You don't want to be in there while they're doing that.
Right.
They're wearing masks.
There's a reason they wear a mask during
installation. You should not be asleep in bed without a mask.
Right.
So 24 to 48 hours, depending on the product, stay out of the house.
Yeah.
Come back, and it hopefully it's not off-gassing. They don't have any proof of it yet, but they also don't have documentation of it actually off-gassing. So I won't say one way or the other. I like the stuff. It does its job.
Yeah.
It really lends itself well to, especially with steel frame construction on a tiny house.
Right.
The benefits just far outweigh the potential risks or risks.
Right.
In my opinion. And there are products out there that are soy-based, but there's still a chemical reaction that happens at the very beginning.
Sure.
And that still is of concern to some people. So
I'm starting to think about that spray foam that I used to use around the house. Should I have been concerned when I was spraying that as far as off-gassing? Should I have been in a hazmat suit?
No, I mean those unless you're trying to insulate an entire wall with a little canister. I'd be more worried about your finger falling off at that point. But no, after that, you're looking at some sort of bat insulation of some sort.
Right.
There's fiberglass bats, there's wool bats, there's Roxol bats, there's recycled denim. There's also blown-in insulation, which is basically like a fiberglass or a wool or a denim that you've got a net and you fill up the cavity in it. Yeah. Those are generally a little bit better because there's less room for installation error. If you put in a bat and there's a gap, or you accidentally framed out a wall cavity too wide and there's now a 2-inch gap on it, a lot of things can go wrong. But with those, you've also got to add a vapor barrier for most products. You've got to have something to keep water from passing through those walls.
Right.
Getting into it, you want it to come out, but you don't want it to get in.
Right.
So there's a lot of different products, and it really is going to depend on what your framing materials are, and what your preference is as far as insulation in the house, and whether you want it to be very natural, that you're kind of doing a green build.
Right.
Maybe do some research into the soy-based expanding foam would be my recommendation up front. But otherwise, there are plenty of products out there. that do their job. It's just the only thing I would say is that make sure they're installed correctly. You know, if they're installed properly, they'll do their job.
Right.
If they're not,
typical with a lot of things.
With most
everything,
things, right?
Yeah.
Do your job.
Do your job.
Do it right.
Read the instructions, because we all know we're so good at that.
Right. And then you get into the finish interior, which is basically endless. You can do whatever you want, mostly in there.
Yeah, you have certain things like, you know, you have so much space to work with, right? So you think about, I mean, one of my favorite areas is the kitchen. So you know, in my case, I'd probably want like maybe a galley kitchen, you know, where I've got a little bit of area on both sides of my tiny home. So these are things I'm thinking of as I design my tiny home in my mind. But then you got, you know, you can do an L shape or like a studio, I guess, just against one wall.
Yeah, you can do a U shape, an L shape, a galley, or a studio.
I think I'm now thinking the U shape.
The U shape, really, I mean, you can only do it really
at the front
one end or the other.
And usually the front end maybe because of a weight. You know.
The weight factor, depending on what materials you're using. If you're doing granite, absolutely.
Keeping your weight towards the front of the trailer.
Yep.
Or over the wheels.
But it just depends on how much time you're spending in your kitchen. You know, if you're a family of 5 and somebody's in there cooking every day for you know 5 people, definitely a larger kitchen with more utility is worth it. But if you're a college student that comes home and microwaves Hot Pockets,
and we've talked with those people, right? There's people that they're like, I just need a microwave and maybe a hot plate or something like that. I'm like, okay, cool.
And then
that's the simple lifestyle,
more room,
right?
and maybe they want to take more baths and less time cooking, so we make room for a bathtub, and not as much counter space.
And you can do bathtubs.
You can do bathtubs.
Full-size bathtubs.
Yep, we'll do full-size bathtubs. We'll do little troughs, little buckets if you want. I think it makes more sense to have a shower, but some people love their bath time, and so they want to make sure that they have that. So that's what I love about the interior portion is, you know, the options are not endless, but they're confined.
Right.
So you've got so much space to work with, but that's where the creativity really comes into play, and making things work and do multiple jobs and incorporating different jobs into different things that normally you wouldn't think of.
Right.
So.
How about as far as, you know, I guess the last thing I was really thinking of as far as the design is the arteries of the tiny home, right? The heater, the cooling, the ventilation, all that kind of stuff. I mean, there are a few things that people may not think of, like, do you typically put a 50-gallon water heater, you know, stand-up water heater in a tiny home? Probably not.
Probably not. The weight factor alone plus the energy use that it does to keep that water hot.
But the ventilation we talked about is, you know, I guess we talked about the thermal envelope, but at the same time, when you have a tiny home sealed up so well, you want to make sure you get the proper amount of ventilation in there. So there's products, obviously, for that that need to be considered.
And that goes beyond just opening a window. The code requirements will be something of a mechanical vent that if there is a situation where there's weather outside and you have to close the windows, you still want that fresh air to be coming in.
Right.
And so heat exchangers are a good way to do that. There are several out there that you can use that will increase your energy efficiency of the house and maintain a comfortable temperature inside as well. So. But yes, doing your insulation correctly and doing it the right way makes these houses essentially airtight. Right. And so you need to make sure that you're circulating fresh air.
Sure. Because I mean, we've heard stories about mold, you know, because it's so sealed up.
Yeah.
So that's one of those things that takes care of that. And then I guess the other thing sometimes people don't think about that I don't think we've talked about yet that I've heard you mention before is dual source for electric or heat, let's say.
My recommendation
especially with solar
for everybody doing a tiny house is that if your heat source is electric, what happens if your electricity runs out?
Right.
This applies more so to anybody trying to be off-grid in any way.
Sure, especially in colder climates.
If you're planning on and you have a situation where all you've got to do is plug in and you're fine, not as big of an issue. Right. But I know a lot of people want to have some sort of off-grid capability of some sort in their house, and so I always recommend 2 sources of heat.
Sure.
You know, if you're running a mini split system and it's run off of electric, maybe have like a propane stove or fireplace in there as well. That maybe not something that you're running all the time,
right,
but something that would be a backup source.
Sure.
Because people, I've had people tell me, well, what happens when your electricity runs out and your heat pump won't work?
Right.
Well, just plug in the heater.
Right. Think a little longer.
Yeah, you got to process that a little bit. I'm going to let you.
All right.
So wood-burning fireplaces are an option. You just make sure that they're done correctly.
Sure.
The only issue is if you work outside of your tiny house,
right.
a wood fireplace, it takes a while to get up and running. You've
right.
got to feed it. You got to take care of it.
It's going to be cold when you come home from work for a little while. Yeah.
Right. So somebody's got to be there to start it up. Versus
or your
pushing
pipes
a
are
button
going to freeze if you live in Alaska or something, maybe.
Right.
But
yeah.
No,
so
I think that's
sure
important. I mean, I've even in my last home, single-family home that I sold, I've lost the furnace there before.
Yeah.
And during winter. And fortunately, we had a natural gas stove in the basement, so just crank that baby up and open all the doors and up to from the basement. And hope the pipes don't freeze.
So going beyond that, the having a dual heat system, basically setting yourself up to be off grid or on grid, because who knows, you have a tiny house in one location. Who's to say you aren't going to move later on? And maybe that's something that you go to a community that is a little bit more off grid. You want to set yourself up to be able to do that without doing a lot of retrofitting to your house. So I recommend people, whether or not you have a flushable toilet, to install a drain, essentially a sewer drain going through your house. You can cap it off and put your composting toilet on top of it. Fill that, the pipe up with insulation, removable. Don't spray it.
Yeah, don't use the spray
Put
insulation.
like a pillow or something in there to seal it up.
Right.
But that way it's plumbed and ready. You can put a cap on it that's down below, and so it's not going to be an issue. But it's done and it's there if you have to move to a place.
Not going to be fun afterwards.
Because if you're a composting toilet and you move from a place where you're completely off grid, out on your own, into a community, composting toilets are not going to be allowed in a community. It's a health and safety issue.
And I don't know how much I really want to talk about this subject, but in all honesty, I think we've met with a lot of people that, you talk about black water, gray water. I mean, black water, you have to, it's, what comes out of you, and
it's stuff that cannot
needs to be treated properly. You can't just dump it, whether it's number one or number two, either one, you can't just dump it, outside your tiny home. Especially
you can if you're by yourself.
Exactly.
And you're up far enough and you got people that are willing to deal with that. But in a community, if you got everybody going to their empty spot, you're going to get a mountain of poo. And it's not safe and healthy in a community standpoint. So you've got to have some sort of, and no municipality is going to allow it. We learned that back in the Roman days when they started building the aqueducts going through. And it was because people were emptying their buckets in the street. And,
it's raining.
Yeah.
I hope this part doesn't make it on. Oh, man.
But setting yourself up for that, whether or not you're going to do solar, set up so that it's easier to install the solar, so that when you do make that decision that we actually do want to do solar, you don't have to pay somebody to come back in and do the entire retro, dig into your walls, mess up your siding, do all that work, have the conduit run, have the panel box there. All they got to do is plug and play and you're ready to go.
Absolutely.
Setting yourself up for change, because there's a lot of change in the industry coming up. With regulations and standards. It is. But the more you can be prepared for it, the better. One of the ways of doing that is by getting your house certified, inspected by one way or another. There are a couple companies out there that'll do that, and they'll inspect to certain codes. None of them require you to meet that code. You can meet and exceed each code, but you at least have to meet it, but none of them will limit you to, you can't go above and beyond. You can always go above and beyond. So that's what we always recommend, and that's what we do in our builds. anticipating the code coming out, we build essentially to the IRC appendix addressing tiny houses.
Right.
Right now, it only applies to tiny houses on foundations, but it is the next step, and that will apply. And so
Yeah, I think that certification process that you were just mentioning is excellent too. I mean, we've talked about it before, where when you get an inspection on your home, it's usually somebody walking in and checking a box and signing their initials after they go look at everything. In this case, with the certification that we provide, you actually get video documentation of each inspection throughout the process that ultimately ends up in a certification that your tiny home was built properly. And I believe we've talked about this before, but it probably already occurs, you may know, but there's going to be places where you want to park your tiny home that you're going to have some kind of certification to get in there. Otherwise, they're taking a risk, that
Absolutely.
there could be a fire or whatever the case is. So.
Yeah. It makes it much easier to get insurance.
Sure.
In addition to that, one of the things I really like about that process is having that video documentation, the picture documentation, if you should need some work done later on down the road.
Right.
You have the ability to look at that video and see what's
Where
inside
your
your wall.
at,
Like my stud is here, my electric is here. Maybe don't drill through the wall here. You can show it to if you're doing it yourself, you can look back and remind yourself, or if you have a professional that wasn't involved in your build doing any work, you can say, here's what's in my wall.
That's pretty amazing.
Versus
how many people can do that, seriously?
Right, versus some guy that wrote on a piece of paper that said, yeah, this was good.
Yeah. No, that is really cool, I think. That's really cool.
So a lot of benefits to that. I think that's where the system as a whole is going to go.
Right.
Whether it's somebody else coming out and doing their own video documentation of it, or the builder themselves being able to do the documentation. I think it's where the industry is headed. And
when I just think
kind of leading the way.
I just think of some of the projects I've done, and I'm bad about capturing progress photos. So now you got your progress photos
You're
too.
required to. Yep.
You show all your friends after you're done. Here's the video of the build of my tiny home. I mean, that'd be cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So pretty exciting stuff.
All right.
Thanks for tuning in, guys. Really appreciate you guys joining us for our conversation about tiny houses. We look forward to doing this again. Hopefully have some new topics and stuff to cover. Definitely look forward to any questions, topics that you guys want us to discuss, and definitely look forward to your feedback.
And please feel free to check us out on tinyhomeconnection.com, or you can follow us on Facebook or Instagram. And thank you, and we look forward to seeing you next time.